Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 2. This week, we're going to cover some concepts that you may have already been exposed to in other communication classes. As I mentioned last week, they're important for you to have as kind of foundational to the course, and you probably will want to reference them or utilize them in your cultural ethnography storytelling. The first is Edward T. Hall and his high context, low context, and monochronic versus polychronic cultural classifications. And then we'll also talk about Geert Hofstede and power distances, masculinity versus femininity, long and short-term orientation. And then we'll also look at some categories that Varner and Beamer discuss in intercultural communication in the workplace. So let's start with Hall's cultural classifications. Edward Hall was an American anthropologist and a cultural researcher, and he was kind of known for low versus high context cultures and also his time dimensions of polychronic and monochronic cultural classifications. Low context communication means that meaning is directly in the words. The messages are direct. You say exactly what you mean what you say. In a high context culture, the meaning is in the context and not directly in the words. So, for example, somewhere like Japan is extremely high context. The Japanese do not want to be rude, so saying no to someone would be considered rude. If you're in a business meeting with Japanese partners, then how do you know a no is a no? If you're observant, you would notice something like the following. They would indicate something might be difficult. They would indicate that they may have, a bit of a disagreement. They may tilt their head. They may suck in through their teeth. They may indicate feelings of discomfort or suggest an unrelated alternative to the problem or change the topic. Sometimes just staying silent without nodding can communicate rejection of an idea. So to look at monochronic versus polychronic cultures, chronos means time, and mono would mean one. So monochronic would see time as a commodity, and they would see this as doing one thing at a time. And that would be a culture that's very punctual, and they would value punctuality. So they would not be multitaskers either. For example, in a meeting, these cultures would rather cover one topic at a time, and they would want that agenda to drive those topics very sequentially and finish one before moving on to another. Poly means many. So polychronic cultures would see time as very fluid and flow through topics. You can be a little bit more in terms of, meandering from one to another. You can kind of exit one topic before completely finishing it and moving on to the next. They're comfortable switching from one activity to another, back to the first one. Meetings may be conversational, even a bit chaotic, and individuals might multitask and do multiple things at one time. So these cultures value relationships and quality of life. For example, if you're doing a meeting in Dubai, you may notice that your Arab counterparts pick up the phone during the meeting, may leave the meeting, come back. That kind of, in that kind of flow that's not necessarily, it's not perceived as rude in a polychronic culture. I have a personal example when I studied in Italy, and there were two kind of cultural norms established. I studied in Italy, but there were also students from Austria. And they were very much two different cultures. The students from Austria very much were monochronic, and the students from Italy were very polychronic. And so when we were set to start classes, and we were at the University of Siena, students from Austria were very, very punctual. We're sitting in class like 10 minutes early, ready to start lecture. And the students from Italy were out having a cigarette, having a cup of coffee. And they were not really concerned with the start of class being extremely punctual. Were coming in at different times, leaving, coming back, and just really observing more of a relaxed polychronic flow to lecture. And the Austrians were really confused as to why things were like this. But the Italians figured when in Rome, this is how we do things. Geert Hofstede was a Dutch social psychologist and an anthropologist. And he talked about 5 dimensions of cultural difference. And today we're really going to look at 3 that have a lot to do with leadership and global communication. And those would be power distance, masculinity and femininity, and long and short-term orientations. Cultures differ in terms of certain qualities that they have. You'll see at the bottom the amount of a certain cultural quality is the lowest, with the lowest index of 0, and the top is at the highest index is 120. So, for example, if we're measuring power distance, cultures on the high end of the continuum value power distance. They're comfortable with the fact that people may have more power than others, and they value rank, hierarchy, recognition of titles. And countries at the bottom with the lowest index believe that closing that power gap is advantageous because they're uncomfortable with big power distances. In a lower power distance culture, it'd be more acceptable to socialize with your boss than in a country with a high power index. Next dimension is masculinity versus femininity. And there are 2 big things that we talk about, and that is what values dominate in society and how social roles are distributed. So in terms of values, masculine societies would believe in more traditional values associated with men, and these would be like achievement, assertiveness, material rewards for success. And in feminine cultures with feminine values, these would value cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, nurturing. Those would be of high importance in these cultures. And in terms of social roles, masculine societies expect that women and men perform different roles. They would have a gap between male and female members. And in feminine societies, there's really no division between roles that men and women perform, or no expectation that there needs to be. Here, the United States is more of a masculine culture. Countries at the bottom, like Portugal, Denmark, and Sweden, are more feminine in terms of both values and social roles. Finally, long and short-term orientation. In business countries that are long-term oriented, value the development of relationships. Business people will not rush into closing a deal and will not expect a quick return on investments. As you can see, the United States is closer to the bottom, which means it's more short-term oriented. And if American business person goes to China, Hong Kong, or Japan, he or she might find it frustrating that they spend the first 2 days socializing and the meetings may seem to go nowhere. And they may not necessarily understand that what seems like a waste of time is investing into building a long-term relationship from the point of view that countries at the top of the graph. However, what looks like a waste of time is in fact investment into building a long-term relationship, because countries at the top of the graph find that to be of importance. if a Chinese or Japanese business person comes to one of the countries at the bottom, let's say Poland, they may feel rushed and generally uncomfortable with the speed at which decisions are made and agreements are reached. The categories that Varner and Beamer discuss, unlike Hall and Hofstede's dimensions, tend to try to address a little bit about how people think deep down. So the first category that they discuss are thinking and knowing, the way that cultures think and the way they know. By concepts or by experience. Some people know when they understand and can use concepts and abstract ideas, whereas others know when they have an experience of something. So the question is important to think about when you're developing a training. What would be more effective for your employees, an online training or a hands-on training? When it comes to knowing a business partner, is it okay to communicate over email and phone, or is face-to-face necessary before closing the deal? It's also important for recruitment. Is it okay to hire somebody based on a resume, reference letters, correspondence with them, or is it necessary to have personal interaction? And the reliability of reference letters varies widely across the globe. So in some countries where relationships are really important, the reference letter may not be a very reliable document, because if I'm writing a reference letter for you in that context, I'm helping you, and my relationship with you is more important than the success of the company that's interviewing you. The next important question in this category is, do people learn by asking questions or by experience? And so think about a classroom. Are students rewarded when they ask a question, or are they rewarded when they reproduce in an activity? In certain types of cultures, it's not always productive to ask questions.
Between ask versus guess culture. Ask culture, typically influenced by Western ideals, value direct communication. Ask for what you want and you expect a direct answer back. For example, hey, can you drive me to the airport on Monday? Guess culture is more nuanced, uses indirect communication, found more in Asian cultures who emphasize harmony. They might drop cues and rely on others to intuit their needs. For example, I have no idea how I'm going to get to the airport on Monday. If guess culture isn't helpful for you, you can practice being more assertive with what you want. The worst case, someone says no.
Is everything knowable by human intelligence, or are some things just unknowable? How do you think this question could be answered in the United States? For comparison, let's look at Russia. A book written by an American business person, Frederick Anderson. He spent about a decade in Russia doing business and had a really positive experience. And he enjoyed thinking about the cultural differences, so he wrote a book called Walking on Ice. And a short excerpt from the book, he wrote, I had a good employee once who I tried to train to make a sales promotion wall chart so he could become a sales manager. You know, a graph with sales curves approximating the best case, most likely, and worst case scenarios. When I returned a week or so later, he hesitated and then pulled the chart from his desk drawer, and I saw that all the lines ran together across the bottom of the chart. Although he was a good salesman and he was liked, he could not predict anything but failure, because then he figured he would be responsible for anything better.
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? You say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17, house number 1. They say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy, it's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had, and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So let's never forget, whether at TED or anywhere else, that whatever brilliant ideas you have or hear, that the opposite may also be true. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
Of course, ideally, in a human life, a human being, you remember what that word means, those two words mean when you put them together. Human is the form that you are, and human is the doing, whatever the form does. The being is who you are in your essence. So you are both. You are the being, the consciousness, and you are the form that that consciousness takes. And the form that that consciousness takes will do things and think and do and act upon the world and be acted upon. So there's hardly any human, there may be some human beings who are completely balanced between the human and the being, who are in the being and the doing, the human and the being. They're right in the middle. Most people go a little bit that way or a little bit more that way. Our civilization as a whole, of course, has gone into the doing mode very, very far to one extreme. So there's the civilization itself is actually mentally ill because of that. And the connectedness with being has been almost entirely lost. So it's a very fragile civilization despite its many achievements.
A subway station in China during rush hour. Which one of you has been on a subway in China before? Well, then you definitely know that getting on a subway in China is not easy. But getting off a subway in China is nearly impossible. People just use their elbows to squeeze themselves away in and don't give you any space to get out. So looking at such examples, in combination with the fact that Chinese don't really express their emotions as much as we do, you might believe that Chinese are tough and cold-hearted people. But in fact, for Chinese, warm relations are very important. You might even say that Maslow has it wrong. Relations are not in the third level of human needs. They're really a necessity in life. And I believe that we, Westerners that tend to point our fingers at what happens in China, I believe that we can even learn from the Chinese and how they deal with others. And if we project that on our own behavior, I think we can become better people. I even wish that every one of you has the opportunity to fly to China once in their lifetime. Not just to climb the Great Wall, but to really listen to the Chinese, to what they have to say. Why is it that a relationship in China is so important? Still, nowadays, many Chinese are strongly influenced by the thoughts of a man named Confucius. His sayings are really like a Bible to the Chinese. I mean, here in the Western world, the Bible gains less and less support nowadays, but in China, his sayings are alive and kicking. 有朋自远方来，不会越乎. It's really a great pleasure to meet friends from afar. So Confucius' philosophy emphasizes personal and governmental morality, correctness of social relationships, justice, sincerity. He champions strong family loyalty, ancestor worship, and respect for the elderly. So knowing this, you might understand why relationships are so important in China, and why you need to build relationships in order to become successful. Maybe some of you have that experience in China. And then you might have heard of the word guanxi. Guanxi literally means connections or relationships, but actually it's much more than that. Guanxi is like how things get done in China. Yes, Chinese are hesitant to deal with people they've never met, and there's a long phase of introduction needed. But once you reach the phase of mutual trust, you will find that Chinese are extremely loyal and faithful.
Have you ever celebrated because you found a 4-leaf clover? Or worried that if you stepped on a crack, you would break your mother's back? If so, you've probably heard of a superstition. Basically, superstitions are beliefs that you can do or see something to either get more luck or to lose luck. Superstitions are pretty amazing because even though there isn't much science to support them, they are cultural habits. That means that they have been passed down in groups for years, so much so that they just become a part of life. Many superstitions, like the fear of the number 13, have religious origins, but some are just because of language coincidences. For example, the number 4 in Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese is very similar to the word for death. It's not surprising, then, that 4 is commonly an unlucky number in these cultures. Also, if you rearrange the Roman numerals for 17, you get vixi, the Latin phrase for I have lived, which implies I died. So the number 17 is avoided throughout Italy, where Latin was spoken during the Roman Empire. So if these are just coincidences, why do we care? It seems that there is evidence of our confidence impacting our success. So if we think we are lucky or unlucky, we might actually perform better or worse on whatever it is we're doing. It turns out we just might be able to create our own luck, at least a little bit.
But in my travels around Egypt and the rest of the world, I started to recognize how powerful this force is of culture, but I knew so little about it. And by extension, I knew so little about myself. So I ditched my plans to become a medical doctor, and I got a PhD in cross-cultural psychology. I wanted to use the tools of science to understand these deeper cultural codes. Since that time, I've been traveling the world trying to understand lots of puzzling differences. So for example, in Singapore, why are people fined for things like chewing gum, or not flushing the toilet, or walking around their homes naked with the curtains open? Go over to New Zealand in contrast, and you'll see people walking barefoot in banks. You'll see them decorating their fences with large quantities of bras. New Zealand is also the only place that I know that has its own national wizard. This guy here is actually a fired professor who went to the streets of New Zealand and was lecturing on everything from rugby to religion. And rather being punished as a deviant, the Prime Minister asked him to be the official wizard of New Zealand. And he was charged with keeping the country entertained, which he did. He's found building large nests on libraries and hatching himself from eggs in art museums. Other puzzling trends can be seen all around the world. Why do Germans wait very patiently at street corners when there's no cars in sight? When in New York or New Jersey, you see people jaywalking with great frequency, even with kids in tow. These examples and many more reflect something very fundamental: how strictly groups abide by social norms. All groups have social norms or rules of behavior. We follow them constantly. And actually, we rarely stop and think about how much we need social norms. I'd like to do a thought experiment with you right now. Imagine you live in a world where people drive on either side of the street as they'd wish, or they ignore traffic lights. In this world, you're in your favorite restaurant, and people are chewing with their mouths wide open, they're burping really loudly, and they're stealing food from each other's plates. Or imagine you board an elevator, and people are facing the back, and they're shaking their umbrellas on each other. Or in this world, imagine that sex is not reserved for private places. People do it on airplanes, on buses, and in movie theaters. This is a world without social norms or any agreed upon standards for behavior. Luckily, humans invented social norms to avoid these kinds of scenarios. They help us predict each other's behavior. They help us coordinate. They're the glue that keep us together. But what I found is that this glue is stronger in some groups than others. Some groups are tight. They have strong norms and punishment for deviance. Other groups are loose. They have weaker norms, and they're much more permissive. And it turns out that this distinction is really important in understanding behavior all around the world, from abroad to at home. I first discovered this difference in a large study that I did with colleagues from around the world, the results of which were published in the journal Science. What we found was that just like we can classify people in terms of their personalities, we can also classify groups in terms of the strength of their norms. So tight-loose is a continuum. Some groups like Japan and Singapore, Austria and Germany veer tight. Other groups like New Zealand or Brazil, Greece or the Netherlands veer loose. I want to leave you with a question that's very important, which is better, tight or loose? Philosophers have been debating this for centuries. Is it better to have rules or is it better to have freedom? Plato, Confucius, and Hobbes wanted rules. They wanted tightness. John Stuart Mill and even Freud advocated for freedom, for looseness. Which is correct? Actually, what if neither are correct? While certainly groups have to veer tight or loose for good reasons, what I've found is that groups that get too extreme in either direction have a lot of problems. When we get extremely loose, things become normless and unpredictable, like that world that we thought about earlier. And it's unbearable. But on the flip side, when we get too tight, it's oppressive and also unbearable. This is what I call the Goldilocks principle of tightness and looseness, that we need a balance of the strength of norms in our everyday lives for the maximal happiness. And we've seen this with our own research. In nations, we see that groups that are either too loose or too tight have more suicide and less happiness. It even applies to our households. Parents who are too over-controlling or parents who are too laissez-faire produce maladaptive kids. It's the balance in households of tight and loose that produces healthy families. It also applies to organizations. The best leaders are ambidextrous. They know how to deploy tightness and looseness at the right time. And innovation is a great example of this. We need looseness to create ideas, but we need tightness to implement them.
Anthropocentrism is basically the notion of human supremacy over all living things. It can drive our sense of entitlement, to see nature as a resource, and it's why we presume to control the world, trying to bend it to our every will and convenience.
In a dominant worldview, we see humans as being fundamentally separate from nature. We just have in our language. We say, going out into nature.
Get out into nature.
In the natural world.
What happens when you go into the wild?
To the wild!
Or we talk about human versus nature.
It's man against nature.
Man versus nature.
Man versus wild.
Nature is this kind of thing that's out there with trees and skies, and even the people who care about saving ecological richness are called environmentalists. Somehow it's the environment that they're caring about, not the actual stuff that happens in the environment. But here's what's interesting. In indigenous cultures everywhere, basically, from Hawaii to Native America to Aboriginal Australia to Aboriginal communities in India, in each of these places, there was a certain way of relating to the rest of nature, not seeing it as a resource to exploit, but seeing it as a living, sacred set of entities.
As indigenous people, we believe the land is alive and it holds memory, and that we have to respect that it's a living system. So one of the reasons why we're in this predicament is because this is a colonial paradigm of turning our beautiful country, living waters and nature into a resource. So when you're talking to Indigenous people, one of the things we want to be clear about is that we're not in any post-colonial framework. Colonialism is continuing. It's an extremely warlike, invasive, destructive way to see and be in the world, where everything is commodified. And so what I see in terms of what's happening around the planet is that there's a very big clash of values. People who see the world and feel the world and build a relationship, and then those that look at the world in terms of seeing these things in nature as a resource to be extracted, to be exploited, to be sold on the open market for the top price.
Our journey begins with the origins and diffusion of the 5 major world religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each emerged in different hearth areas and spread over time through various means. Hinduism, the oldest of these religions, dates back to at least 1500 BCE. It originated in the Indus River Valley, evolving from the ancient Vedic religion. A polytheistic faith, Hinduism recognizes a supreme being called Brahman, but also venerates many gods and goddesses. Mainly through cultural diffusion and migration, Hinduism spread, particularly within South Asia and Southeast Asia. Fast forward to the 1st century CE, Christianity emerged in Judea, a province of the Roman Empire. Today, it's the largest religion in the world with 2.4 billion followers, Christianity, a monotheistic faith, believes in one God and the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It has spread through contact conversion, colonization, and missionary work, especially in Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Islam, the second largest religion in the world, originated in the 7th century CE in Mecca, a city in present-day Saudi Arabia. With 1.9 billion followers, Islam is a monotheistic religion that believes in one God, called Allah, and follows the 5 pillars of Islam. Islam has spread through migration, trade, conquest, and missionary work, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Now imagine a map showing the dominant religion in each country, based on the percentage of the population that adheres to it. The world's population is divided into different religious groups, each distributed across different regions and countries. Religion doesn't just influence the beliefs and practices of people, it also shapes the culture and environment of different regions. It affects language, art, architecture, food, clothing, education, politics, and values. It even impacts the natural resources, land use, climate change, and biodiversity of the environment. For instance, consider Islam. It plays a strong role in the culture of believers, shaping their values, actions, food, and dress. Islam also significantly impacts the landscape of regions where it is practiced, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. In this video, we've journeyed through the geography of world religions, exploring their origins, diffusion, and impact. We've seen how these religions vary across the world, and how they influence culture and environment in different regions. Religion, a fascinating and complex aspect of human geography, offers a lens through which we can appreciate the diversity and richness of our world.